The first time I realized my front door was not really my front door anymore. It was already opening. I was standing barefoot on the cool tile in my kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug I had forgotten in the sink, when I heard the soft metal click, then the long, slow sigh of hinges easing inward like somebody had done it before and knew exactly how much pressure to use. I turned, water still running over my hand, and saw the shadow move across the frosted glass beside the entry. Before I even saw her face, I knew who it was. Deborah Whitmore. You can laugh if you want, but some people arrive before their bodies do. Hers was that thick vanilla perfume that hung in the air too long. Mixed with the sharp smell of paper and printer ink from the clipboard she always carried pressed against her hip like a badge. Deborah was the kind of woman who never knocked like a normal person. She performed knocking. 3 hard taps, 1 pause, then the handle. Like she had already decided the answer for you. My name is Ethan Parker, and at that point I had lived in that house for a little over 3 years, long enough to know every creak in the floor, every rattle in the vent by the hallway, every afternoon patch of light that slid across the living room wall around 5:40 p.m. It was a small place on the curve of a quiet cul-de-sac, nothing fancy, just pale siding, a narrow front porch, 2 square columns, and a maple tree out front that dropped helicopters into the gutter every spring. But it was mine. After 12-hour shifts, after noise, traffic, deadlines, and people who always needed something, that house was the one place in my life that still felt like a closed hand. Deborah had spent the better part of 6 months trying to pry that hand open. At first it was the usual HOA nonsense. My trash bin was visible from the street for 14 hours instead of 12. My lawn was a 1/4 inch above regulation after a week of rain. My mailbox post was apparently the wrong shade of black, which was impressive because it was black. Then the notes started appearing with no stamp and no envelope, folded in half and jammed under my doormat like little threats that had dressed themselves up as reminders. Then the reminders got stranger. I would come home and find the mat turned 90 degrees. A planter nudged 6 inches to the left. The side gate unlatched when I knew I had clicked it shut that morning. Once, the blinds near the entry window were tilted at a different angle than I had left them, just enough that I stood in my own living room staring at them with my keys still in my hand, feeling something cold move under my ribs. I told myself not to be dramatic. I told myself neighborhoods like this ran on gossip, control, and people with too much time. I told myself Deborah was annoying, not dangerous. But annoyance does not test your doorknob. Annoyance does not linger on your porch long enough for the motion light to shut off and kick back on again. The first time I caught her on camera, she was standing so close to my front window that all I saw at first was the cream sleeve of her blazer and 1 pearl earring glinting in the reflection. She leaned in, cupped 1 hand around the glass, and tried to look past the curtain into my house like she was checking inventory. When I emailed the board, they thanked me for my concern. When I called, they said Deborah was conducting informal compliance checks for the benefit of the community. Informal. Compliance. Benefit. That is how people like her hide a trespass inside polished language. So I replaced the deadbolt. I added another camera above the porch light. I started double-checking the windows before bed. And still, every few days, there was some new little sign that Deborah had been close enough to touch things she had no business touching. The worst part was not the invasion itself. It was the smile she wore every time I confronted her in daylight, out by the curb or near the mailboxes, like we were both actors in a play only she had rehearsed. Wide, friendly, harmless. Ethan, she would say, I am just trying to preserve standards. As if standards included standing on my porch at dusk with your hand on my door. As if community meant access. As if a woman with a clipboard could keep stepping over a line and make the line disappear. That evening, with the kitchen faucet still running, and my pulse loud in my ears, I watched the door drift inward another 2 inches and smelled that vanilla perfume slip into my house before she did, and something inside me changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for me to understand one simple thing. Deborah Whitmore was never going to stop because nobody had ever made her pay for crossing a boundary. And what she did not know, what she could not possibly know as her shadow stretched across my entryway, was that I had already started noticing exactly where she liked to put her hands. Once you notice a pattern, you stop hearing events as accidents. You hear them as footsteps. After that evening, I started treating my own front porch like a crime scene nobody else wanted to admit existed. I did not say that out loud because I knew how it would sound. A grown man in a quiet subdivision, rattled by a woman with a clipboard and a practiced smile. But the next morning, I walked the entryway with a legal pad and my phone, taking pictures of everything before I left for work. The brass kick plate, the angle of the doormat, the position of the umbrella stand inside the door, the tiny ceramic bowl on the narrow console table where I dropped my keys every night. It sounds obsessive until you come home and realize the bowl has been turned a few inches clockwise and your doormat is no longer centered under the welcome sign. Little things. Always little things. That was Deborah Whitmore's real talent. She never moved enough to look crazy to anybody else. She moved exactly enough to make you doubt yourself. 2 days later, I came home just after 6, and the side gate was resting against the latch instead of inside it. I know the difference between almost closed and closed. I grew up fixing fences and cabinet doors with my father, and he used to tell me that hardware always tells the truth if you pay attention. That latch told me somebody had been in my backyard while I was gone. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. A patio chair had been nudged half a foot closer to the window over my sink. One of the citronella candles on the table had a fingerprint in the dust across the lid. That night I sat at my kitchen counter with the overhead light off, my laptop open, and drafted the most polite email of my life to the HOA board. I attached timestamps from the porch camera. I described the repeated entryway visits. I asked, very clearly, whether any board member had authority to enter private property without consent. By morning I had a reply from the secretary, written in that sterile neighborhood management tone that makes everything sound both official and useless. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Deborah has been conducting informal visual inspections related to community standards. Informal visual inspections. They wrapped trespassing in satin words and expected me to thank them for the gift basket. I replied again, this time with still images. Deborah near the front glass. Deborah on the porch after dusk. Deborah standing close enough to my threshold that one step forward would put her inside my entry space. I even circled the door handle in one image where her fingers were hovering inches away from it. No answer. The next afternoon I passed her by the neighborhood mailbox cluster, and she looked like she had been waiting for me. Cream blazer. White capri pants. Low heels that clicked against the concrete with perfect little notes of irritation. She smiled before I even reached my box. Ethan, she said, as if we were old friends and not two people standing on opposite sides of a line she kept pretending not to see. I told her calmly that she needed to stop coming onto my porch and touching my door. She tilted her head and gave me that warm suburban smile people use when they're trying to turn you into the unreasonable one. I do not touch your door, she said. I observe exterior compliance. It benefits everyone when standards are maintained. I asked her what standard required leaning into my front window after dark. That made her blink just once. Then she laughed a little and said she was making sure my address numbers were visible from the street. My address numbers were on a black plaque under the porch light, 3 inches tall, bright white, and visible from halfway down the block. She knew that. I knew that. But people like Deborah live on the hope that if they say something with enough confidence, facts will get embarrassed and leave the room. I started checking the camera. Every night after that. Not because I wanted to, but because not checking felt worse. Most of the clips were empty porch, moths in the light, delivery drivers, one neighbor's tabby cat cutting through the flower bed like it paid taxes there. Then on Friday, just after a hard spring rain, I found the clip that made the back of my neck go cold. Deborah came up my front walk holding a folded umbrella. Her hair was tucked behind one ear, damp from the weather, and she looked around once, slow and casual, not like a visitor, but like somebody checking for witnesses. Then she stepped into the narrow pocket of space between the column and the front door, the one spot my original camera did not fully catch, and she reached for the handle. Not hovered near it. Not gestured at it. Reached for it. I watched her fingers close, twist, pause, then release when the deadbolt held. After that she leaned toward the side glass and peered in, one hand braced against the trim like my house owed her balance. I replayed the clip 3 times, listening to the rain tapping the porch roof and the soft metallic rattle of my own locked door under her hand, and I realized I had been thinking too small. Deborah was not nosy. She was not overinvolved. She was testing limits. And the thing about people who test limits is that once they stop getting resistance, they always press a little farther the next time. That weekend, I stopped trying to convince myself that the board would handle it. People always tell you to document everything like documentation is some kind of magic spell, but what they do not tell you is how lonely it feels when you are the only person in the room treating a pattern like a pattern. I spent Saturday morning at my dining table with my laptop, a yellow legal pad, and 3 printed screenshots spread out in front of me like evidence from a trial nobody wanted to schedule. Same porch, same angle, same woman, different days. In one image, Deborah was standing near the side glass with her head tilted toward the living room. In another, she was half hidden behind the porch column, close enough to my front door that I could practically feel the pressure of her presence through the frame. In the third, the one that bothered me most, her fingers were wrapped around the handle like it belonged to her for the length of a heartbeat. I wrote down every date and time, then every small thing that had happened after. Doormat shifted, gate unlatched, blinds tilted, porch planter turned. Nothing dramatic on its own. Together, it read like somebody circling a fence line, looking for the loose board. Around noon, I drove to the management office 2 miles outside the subdivision, a beige suite in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax service. The lobby smelled like lemon cleaner and old carpet. A woman at the front desk with reading glasses on a chain took my folder, gave me a thin smile, and disappeared into the back for almost 10 minutes before returning to tell me the property manager was unavailable but would review my concerns. Concerns. That word again, smooth and harmless, like I was reporting a noisy sprinkler instead of repeated attempts to push past my front door. I asked if any board member had legal authority to enter a homeowner's porch alcove or manipulate a door handle without permission. She said she could not provide legal advice. I asked if she could at least answer yes or no. She smiled the way people do when they plan to outlast your patience and said someone would follow up by email. Nobody did. On the drive home, I remember the sunlight flashing through the windshield in hard white bars, and I remember thinking that Deborah probably already knew I had gone there. Neighborhood people like her always seem to know. They do not gather information the way normal people do. They absorb it through gossip, landscaping crews, mailbox conversations, and the strange little web of people who are terrified of being on their bad side. By the time I turned onto my street, I was no longer angry in the hot, immediate way. I was calm, which was worse for her. Calm meant I had stopped expecting fairness and started thinking about proof. That evening I pulled into my garage, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute listening to the metallic tick of cooling parts and the faint hum of the freezer against the back wall. My garage was the one place in the house that still felt completely under my control. Shelves labeled in black marker. Tools lined by size. Extension cords coiled tight. Paint cans on the top rack from old projects I had finished and forgotten. I stood up on the work stool to move a box of drop cloths, and that is when I saw it shoved behind a gallon of primer. Cobalt blue exterior trim paint. Left over from the previous fall when I had repainted the porch columns after a storm peeled the old finish near the base. I pulled the can down and popped the lid just enough to look. The surface was thick but still usable, deep and bright, and almost electric under the overhead bulb. The kind of blue that does not blend in with anything. The kind of blue that would show on cream fabric from 20 feet away. I stood there with the paint can in my hand and remembered every careful step Deborah took through my entry space. The way she angled her body around the right side of the porch column to get closer to the door. The way her left hand liked to brace on the trim while her right hand tested the handle. Not random movement. Repeated movement. Habit. That was when the idea came together so cleanly it felt less like invention and more like finally seeing the picture that had been there the whole time. I was not going to confront her again in daylight. I was not going to send another email into the void and wait for a reply written by somebody paid to sound neutral. I was going to let Deborah do what Deborah always did. I was just going to make sure that this time, when she crossed the line would leave a mark. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because once an idea settles into your head, it starts moving furniture around in there until you deal with it. The house was still dim, washed in that gray-blue light that comes just before sunrise, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tap of maple seeds hitting the front gutter outside. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen counter, and looked straight through the hallway toward the front door, tracing Deborah's path in my mind the way an engineer studies stress lines. In steel. She always came from the left side of the porch after stepping around the column. She always angled herself into that narrow entry pocket where the camera had the weakest view. She always reached with one hand and steadied herself with the other. Habit again. Predictable people are dangerous for exactly one reason. They think routine makes them invisible. I took the coffee into the garage and set the cobalt blue paint on the workbench under the fluorescent light. The color looked even brighter in the morning, almost cheerful, which made it funnier to me somehow. This was not going to be some wild stunt or anything reckless. I was not trying to hurt anyone. I was doing what I had already done once before on that very porch, just a little more strategically. I stirred the paint with a wooden stick until the pigment rose from the bottom and the whole turned rich and smooth, like wet glass. Then I pulled out the old photos from last fall on my phone to compare where I had originally touched up the trim. The right side of the inner porch post had always been slightly more sheltered from the weather than the front face, which meant fresh paint there would not look immediately suspicious if anyone happened to glance over from the street. More important, it was the exact place a person would brush against only if they pushed too far into my entry space. A normal visitor, standing where a normal visitor stands, would never touch it. That mattered to me. I wanted the truth built into the setup. By 8 o'clock, I had already run through every angle in my head twice. I cleaned the section of trim with a damp cloth, let it dry, then put blue painter's tape along the edge so the line stayed neat. The irony of using painter's tape with paint as evidence was not lost on me. I worked slowly, careful not to drip on the welcome mat or the concrete, laying down a clean strip of cobalt on the side of the post from about knee height to just above my shoulder. Enough area to catch a sleeve, a wrist, a handbag, whatever part of Deborah decided it had permission to enter my life that day. Then I stepped back and looked at it from the sidewalk. Invisible. From the driveway. Barely noticeable. From inside the entry pocket where she liked to lurk. Impossible to miss if you actually belonged there. I left it to tack up while I adjusted the camera. That part took longer. The original porch camera covered the broad front view well enough for packages and visitors, but I wanted no dead space now. I installed a second compact camera under the eave near the porch light, angled lower, tight enough to catch hands, fabric, and the trim itself. No dramatic, obvious hardware. Just one more quiet eye. After lunch, I drafted one more email to the HOA board, careful and precise, stating again that no representative had permission to enter my porch alcove, test my door, or inspect any part of my home without my consent. I did not mention the paint. I did not need to. The point of a boundary is not announcing how you will defend it. The point is making the boundary undeniable after it is crossed. I sent the email, printed a copy, and tucked it into the folder with the screenshots and notes. Then I did something I had not done in weeks. I sat in my own living room with the blinds open. Not wide, not inviting, just open enough to remind myself that I was allowed to exist comfortably inside my own house without arranging my life around somebody else's obsession. Around 4:30 the sun shifted across the porch, warming the wood and pulling that faint fresh paint smell through the front hall, sharp and clean and almost sweet under the dust and linen smell of the house. It took me right back to last fall when I had repaired the storm damage, standing outside with a radio playing and thinking I was improving a home. Funny how the same material can become something else entirely depending on who is about to touch it. By early evening the blue had set enough to cling, but not enough to hide what it was. Perfect. I turned on the porch light before dusk, more for contrast on camera than anything else, and left the front room lamp off so the glass would reflect less from inside. Then I waited. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood just after dinner, when garage doors stop grinding open, sprinklers click on in the distance, and the last delivery truck rolls out like the day is packing up its tools. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone face up beside me, the camera feed ready, and listened to the house hold its breath. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once and went quiet. A minute later I heard heels on concrete, measured and familiar, coming up my front walk. The sound of her heels on the front walk was so distinct by then that I could have picked it out from behind a wall of traffic. Sharp, measured, unhurried. Not the pace of a guest. The pace of somebody arriving at a place she believed belonged to her authority. I did not move from the kitchen table. I only tapped the camera feed open on my phone and watched the porch come into view in cool evening color, the porch light throwing that pale yellow halo over the concrete and the white trim of the entry. A second later, Deborah Whitmore stepped into frame wearing a cream blazer over a light blouse. The same kind of neat neighborhood uniform she always wore when she wanted to look like rules had somehow taken human form. Her clipboard was tucked under one arm. Her hair was set. Her lipstick was perfect. And even through the phone screen, I could almost smell that heavy vanilla perfume reaching through the cracks in my front door. She did not knock. Of course she did not. She paused just outside the porch light and looked up and down the street first, one slow sweep to the left, then to the right. The way people do when they know what they are about to do only looks normal from a distance. The neighborhood was quiet. A sprinkler clicked somewhere across the cul-de-sac. A garage door rumbled 2 houses over, then settled. Deborah took one step up into the entry pocket, then another, sliding herself into that narrow strip between the porch column and the front door where she thought the camera lost her. Only this time it did not. I had the angle perfectly. I could see the side of her blazer, the pearl earring catching the porch light, the clipboard edge pressed against her hip. More important, I could see her left hand reach out, exactly like I knew it would, fingers extended toward the trim for balance as she leaned in. Toward my front door. She made contact almost casually at first, a light brush of fingertips against the side of the post. Then her palm flattened as she shifted her weight and reached with the other hand toward the handle. On the screen, I saw the moment she felt it. Her body stiffened before her face changed, as if her skin understood what had happened a beat before her mind caught up. She drew her hand back, looked down, and for half a second did not seem to understand why her fingers had turned bright cobalt blue under the porch light. Then she jerked away from the trim too fast, and the outside of her blazer sleeve dragged right across the painted section from wrist to hip in one smooth, perfect streak. The blue against the cream fabric was almost beautiful. It was vivid, impossible, theatrical in the cleanest way, like truth had finally decided to stop being subtle. Deborah froze, staring down at herself. Her mouth moved first, forming a small, shocked line before she hissed something I could not fully hear through the camera audio. Then she grabbed at the stain with the edge of her blouse cuff, which only made it worse, pushing the cobalt into a wider smear across the sleeve and leaving bright fingerprints near the lapel. I sat very still in my kitchen and let her panic play out in silence. She looked around the porch, suddenly alert to details she had ignored every other time she came creeping into my space. The trim, the light, the angle of the camera, the front windows. She stepped back and stared at the door like it had betrayed her. Then, with the sort of nerve only a person like Deborah possesses, she reached for the handle anyway. She twisted once. Locked. Again, harder this time. Locked. That tiny metal rattle echoed through the house and settled in my chest like a bell. She knew I was home. She had to know. The truck was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on behind me. But entitlement makes people bold right up until proof lands on their sleeve. She leaned toward the side glass, trying to peer inside, and that was when the porch light hit her hand fully. Blue in the lines of her knuckles. Blue along the edge of her manicure. Blue in the crease, where her thumb met her palm. Not a spot. Not an accident. A record. She pulled back so suddenly that the clipboard slipped from under her arm and smacked the concrete. Paper slid halfway out. For a second, she just stood there breathing hard, one hand hovering in the air like she was afraid to touch anything else. Then she bent, snatched up the clipboard, and dug her phone out of her bag with her clean hand. She jabbed at the screen, held it to her ear, and turned away from the door. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough through the microphone to make my stomach go cold in a completely different way. She said my name first, clipped and furious. Then she said, very clearly, he set me up. After that she lowered her voice and stepped to the edge of the porch, looking out toward the street instead of back at my house. And when the camera widened just enough as she moved, I saw headlights idling at the curb beyond my mailbox, a dark SUV sitting there with the engine running the whole time. For a second I forgot about the blue paint completely because the sight of that SUV sitting at the curb changed the shape of the whole evening. Up until then, I had been dealing with one woman who thought a clipboard and a board vote gave her permission to trespass. Now there was a running engine, low headlights washing across my mailbox, and somebody waiting out there in the dark while Deborah stood on my porch with my paint on her hands. She turned her back to the camera and hissed into her phone, pacing one tight step left, one step right, trying to keep her voice low, but the porch microphone caught fragments anyway. I heard ridiculous. I heard hazardous. I heard he knew. Then she glanced toward the street and said, "No, do not drive off yet." My house felt suddenly smaller around me, not because I was afraid in the loud, dramatic way people imagine fear, but because everything I had suspected about Deborah being too confident, too protected, too comfortable crossing lines clicked into place all at once. She had not come here alone because she expected to get away with it alone. She had brought backup, or a witness, or somebody she trusted to help rewrite the story after the fact. On the screen, the driver door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad through the shoulders, late 50s maybe, wearing a navy quarter zip and khakis like he had come straight from a golf course or a homeowner's meeting. Even in the grainy porch view, I recognized him after a second. Martin Keeler, vice president of the HOA board. Of course it was Martin. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice because he had spent most of his life around people willing to do that part for him. He moved with the easy confidence of somebody who believed any conflict was basically a paperwork problem waiting for the right tone of voice. He came up the walk quickly, looked once toward my dark front windows, then stepped onto the porch beside Deborah and stopped dead when he saw the streak across her blazer. Even through the camera, I could see the calculation happen in his face. Not concern. Not surprise. Calculation. Deborah thrust her stained hand toward him and started talking fast, the words spilling now that she had an ally physically beside her. She pointed at the post, then at my door, then at the camera, and Martin held up both hands in a calming motion, not because he was shocked by what she had done, but because he was already trying to manage what it looked like. He leaned in close to inspect the paint on the trim, careful not to touch it, then shook his head and said something I could not hear. Deborah snapped back immediately. Whatever he had said, she did not like it. Her whole body was tense now, shoulders high, clipboard jammed under her arm, one hand smeared blue and held away from her body like evidence she wanted to throw at someone. Martin turned toward the door then, and for one brief second his eyes lifted directly to where he knew the camera had to be. That was the moment I understood this was bigger than neighborhood pettiness. He was not surprised a camera existed. He was surprised it had caught this angle. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the front hall quietly enough that the floorboards did not announce me. I did not open the door yet. I just stood on my side of it and listened. Through the wood I could hear Deborah's breathing, quick and sharp, and Martin's lower voice trying to sand the edges off the situation. Then came the sentence that made every email, every brushed-off complaint, every little shifted object make terrible sense. Martin said, "Deborah, I told you not to test the handle again unless we knew he was gone." I do not think either of them realized how clearly sound carries through a door when the porch is still and the person inside has gone completely motionless. Nobody spoke for about 2 full seconds after that, as if even the air on the porch understood something had slipped out that could not be put back. Then Deborah said, much lower now, "He was supposed to get cited this week," and Martin answered, "Not if you keep doing this." I stared at my own deadbolt, the brushed steel reflecting a sliver of hallway light, and felt that cold calm settle over me again, deeper this time. They were not just snooping. They had been building something around me, testing access, gathering excuses, looking for a way to make me the problem. Outside, Martin cleared his throat, stepped closer to the door, and changed his tone into the smooth public voice I had heard at board meetings. "Ethan," he called, gentle as a church usher, "we need to discuss a safety issue regarding your front entryway." I looked at the live feed one more time, at Deborah's blue-streaked sleeve glowing under my porch light like a signed confession, and finally reached for the lock. I unlocked the deadbolt but kept the chain on, opening the door just wide enough for the porch light to spill across my hallway floor in a long pale strip. Up close, the blue looked even brighter on Deborah's blazer, a hard cobalt slash across cream fabric, with smaller smears along her fingers and the side of her palm, like she had signed her name in wet paint without meaning to. Martin recovered first. Men like him usually do. He put on that composed neighborhood official expression, the one that says everything is under control even when the floor is already giving way under their shoes. "Ethan," he said, smooth and measured, "we are concerned that you may have created an unsafe condition at your entry." I looked at him, then at Deborah, then at the exact handprint she had left on my trim, and I asked the only question that mattered. "Unsafe for who?" Deborah's face tightened. Up close I could see a tiny vein pulsing near her temple, and her perfume was almost overwhelming now, sweet and dense, fighting with the fresh, clean smell of paint still hanging around the porch. She lifted her stained hand like a piece of evidence and said I had set a trap. Not painted my own doorpost. Not marked private property. Set a trap. The choice of words told me everything. I kept my voice level and asked why she had touched the inside edge of my porch column at all. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then snapped that she was conducting an inspection. I asked if inspections required testing my doorknob. Martin cut in fast, too fast. Let us not escalate this, he said. We are simply trying to address a misunderstanding before it becomes a formal issue. That was almost enough to make me laugh. A misunderstanding. As if she had accidentally leaned into a private entry alcove, accidentally braced her hand on the one surface only a trespasser would touch, accidentally rattled my locked door while he sat outside in a running SUV waiting for the outcome. I looked straight at Martin and said through the crack in the door, I heard you tell her not to test the handle again unless you knew I was gone. For the first time since he stepped onto my porch, his face changed. It was subtle, just a slight flattening around the eyes, but there it was. Deborah turned and stared at him, and in that half-second of silence the whole little alliance between them became visible. She had been reckless. He had been managing it. Neither of them expected me to have both the footage and the audio. Martin cleared his throat and shifted his weight, trying to move back into control. Ethan, he said, I think you are taking fragments out of context. Then he glanced past the edge of the door as if he could somehow talk his way through solid wood and rewrite the last 5 minutes. I told him there was nothing out of context about a board vice president waiting at the curb while another board member tried my front door. Deborah stepped forward then, furious enough to forget herself. Her clipboard bumped the chain with a metallic click, and she said I had made the community unsafe, that residents needed access if there were compliance concerns, that homeowners did not get to hide behind locked doors when standards were at risk. The sentence just hung there between us, ridiculous and ugly and more honest than anything she had said in daylight. Residents need access. Not notice. Not permission. Access. I felt something inside me settle at that. Not anger. Certainty. I told her she had just explained the entire problem better than I ever could. Then I asked Martin if that was the official position of the board, that members could enter private residential entry spaces and manipulate doors in the name of standards. He did not answer. Instead, he looked at the blue streak again, and I could almost see the math happening behind his eyes. If he defended her, he tied himself to what she had done. If he abandoned her, she might start talking. Deborah misread his silence as support and kept going, voice rising, words coming faster, saying my landscaping had already been under review, that my mailbox measurements were likely non-compliant, that there were concerns about visual neglect and unapproved exterior changes. It was a flood now, not policy. She was grabbing at anything she could stack around me to make my locked door seem like part of a bigger offense. I let her talk because every second she talked, she made the same mistake. She sounded less like a woman surprised by paint and more like somebody angry that a homeowner had finally made access difficult. When she stopped to breathe, I asked one more question, very quietly. If my front entry is not private, Deborah, why did you look both ways before stepping into it? She just stared at me. Martin exhaled through his nose and said they should leave. It was the first smart thing either of them had done all evening. But before he could turn away, I told them both that the video had already been backed up, the audio had already been saved, and the next conversation about my property would not happen on my porch. It would happen in a room where words like inspection and misunderstanding had to survive under fluorescent lights and official minutes. Deborah's expression changed then, not to shame, not even to fear exactly, but to the first thin crack in confidence. She looked down at the blue on her sleeve as if seeing it for what it really was now. Not paint. Proof. After they left, I did not sleep much. The neighborhood settled into its usual nighttime sounds, sprinklers whispering across lawns, a distant television leaking through somebody's open den window, the low rush of traffic from the main road a half-mile away. But inside my house, everything felt sharpened, outlined, almost too clear. I sat at the kitchen table until after midnight with my laptop open, exporting every clip from both cameras, naming each file with the date and time, then backing them up twice, once to an external drive, and once to cloud storage. I saved screenshots of the blue on Deborah's hand, the smear on her blazer, Martin stepping onto my porch, the two of them standing there under my light like they still had not fully understood they had walked into a record instead of a private moment. I typed a summary while the details were fresh, every word they said that I could remember, every sound, every sequence. By 1 in the morning, the folder on my desktop looked less like neighborhood drama and more like a case file. That thought should have made me feel dramatic. Instead, it made me feel calm. The next day was Saturday, and by 9:30 my phone started buzzing with the first tremors of fallout. Not from the board, from neighbors. A text from Melissa 2 houses down asking if everything was all right, because she had seen Deborah at the mailbox that morning wearing a scarf, even though it was already 72 degrees. Another from Grant across the cul-de-sac saying Martin had left the community pool area early after some kind of argument in the parking lot. Neighborhoods work like that. Official channels move like wet cement, but gossip moves at the speed of light. I did not answer with drama. I just said there had been an incident on my porch, and I was documenting it. Around noon I got the email I had been expecting, only it came faster than I thought it would. Official notice from the HOA board. Subject line, immediate safety concern. The body of the email was almost elegant in its dishonesty. It claimed the board had received a report of hazardous material being applied to a front entry surface in a way that might endanger residents and invited me to attend an emergency board meeting Monday evening to address the matter. Nothing about unauthorized entry. Nothing about attempted access. Nothing about Deborah touching a private surface inside my entry alcove while Martin waited at the curb. Just hazardous material, residents, safety. It was not a response. It was a pivot. I read it twice, then once more slowly, and noticed something almost funny in the list of recipients. They had copied the full board, including a woman named Linda Carver, who had only been on the board for about 4 months and had a reputation for actually reading things before repeating them. That mattered. I replied to all. Calm tone. Clear language. I stated that any discussion of my property needed to include the full video and audio record of a board member entering my private entry space, manipulating my door handle, and making statements indicating repeated attempts had occurred before. I attached still images, including one of Deborah's hand on the trim and one of Martin approaching from the idling SUV. I also attached screenshots of my earlier unanswered complaints. Then I ended with one sentence that I knew would sit in their inboxes like a dropped glass. I look forward to discussing why unauthorized physical access to my home appears to have been normalized under the label of community standards. It took 23 minutes for Martin to call. I let it ring out. He left a voicemail in the exact same polished tone he had used through the crack in my door, saying he believed there had been an unfortunate misunderstanding and that it would be best for everyone if we resolved the matter privately before Monday. Privately. That word told me he understood the risk now. People only want privacy after public facts begin to form. An hour later, Deborah called too, which surprised me more. She did not leave a voicemail, but she called twice in 6 minutes. I pictured her at her kitchen island with that blue-stained blazer probably soaking in a sink somewhere, trying to decide whether indignation or charm would save her faster. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had grown strangely watchful. Curtains shifted. Cars slowed a little near my house. A man walking his dog paused longer than necessary at the corner. No one knocked, but everyone was listening for something. I spent the rest of the day preparing instead of stewing. I printed the email chain. I made a timeline. I pulled county property maps showing lot boundaries and the dimensions of my front porch alcove. I even found the purchase receipt for the camera upgrade in case anyone tried to pretend the footage had been manipulated. By early evening, my dining table was covered in neat stacks of paper, and the house smelled faintly of ink, coffee, and the last clean trace of that cobalt paint near the front hall. When the sun dropped and the porch light clicked on automatically, I stood by the entry for a moment and looked at the trim where the smear had happened. There was still the faint outline of a hand where the paint had been disturbed, just enough texture left to show contact. Proof always leaves a shape. Monday was supposed to be their meeting, their room, their process, their little stage for turning facts into policy language. But as I stood there in the quiet with that blue mark drying into history on my doorpost, I had the distinct feeling that by the time Monday arrived, I was not going to be the one walking into that room at a disadvantage. Monday arrived with the kind of bright, polished sky that makes everything in a suburban neighborhood look cleaner than it really is. By 8 in the morning, the sidewalks were already warming under the sun, and the maple in my front yard was throwing thin shadows across the porch like nothing had happened there at all. I went to work, kept my head down, answered emails, sat through a meeting I barely heard, and felt the whole day ticking forward in the back of my skull like a second clock. Around lunch, my phone buzzed with a new email from the board. Revised agenda attached. My name was still on it, but so was a new item just above mine. Executive review of board conduct procedures. That was the first sign the ground had shifted. Somebody on that email chain had read more than the subject line. Somebody had realized this was no longer just about a painted post. I left work a little early, drove home, changed into a clean button-down, and packed everything into a slim black folder that snapped shut with the kind of sound that makes a person feel organized even if his pulse is running too fast. Printouts of the footage stills, the unanswered complaints, the county map, my written timeline, and on top, because I wanted it easy to reach, a color print of Deborah's hand pressed against my porch trim in unmistakable cobalt blue. The meeting was held in the clubhouse by the pool, a low brick building with beige trim and a multi-purpose room that always smelled faintly of chlorine, coffee, and old paper. By the time I got there, the parking lot was fuller than I had ever seen it for a Monday board session. That told me the gossip had outrun the agenda. Neighbors were already filtering through the glass doors in quiet little clusters, wearing the expressions people wear when they came for rules and secretly hope for theater. Inside, rows of metal folding chairs faced a long table draped in navy cloth where the board usually sat like a panel of judges at the smallest courthouse in America. Martin was already there, shuffling papers too neatly. Deborah sat 2 seats down from him in a pale gray jacket instead of cream this time. But even from the doorway, I could see a faint blue tint lingering at the edge of one cuff and near the base of one thumbnail. She had tried to scrub it out. She had not won. The fluorescent lights were unforgiving. Linda Carver was at the far end of the table with reading glasses low on her nose, flipping through a stapled packet and frowning in a way that looked less emotional than mathematical. Good. I signed in, chose a seat in the second row instead of the back, and set my folder on my lap. Nobody spoke to me directly, but the air around me changed. People looked, then looked away, then looked again. I caught fragments of whispering. That is him. Blue paint. Martin was there too. It was not loud, but it was enough. Deborah kept her chin up and her mouth pressed into a line, so tight it looked painful. She never once looked at me. At 6:30 sharp, the board president, a retired dentist named Howard Bell, tapped a pen against his water glass and called the meeting to order. His voice had that strained cheerfulness of a man who already regretted agreeing to volunteer for anything. They moved through 2 routine items first, landscaping bids and a gate repair estimate, both delivered with the flat, brittle energy of people pretending the room was not actually there for something else. Then Howard cleared his throat, adjusted the papers in front of him, and announced the executive review item. Before he could say more, Linda leaned toward her microphone and asked whether the board intended to discuss homeowner evidence that had been circulated in the reply all chain or whether the board planned to characterize the matter solely as a safety complaint. The room went very still after that. Martin looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected cooperation and gotten independence instead. Howard blinked twice and said all relevant materials would be considered. Linda nodded once, unsatisfied but willing to let the sentence stand for the moment. Then came my item. Howard began reading from the prepared notice about hazardous material on a residential entry surface, but he barely made it through the second line before Deborah interjected, saying the issue was that homeowners could not be allowed to create concealed risks where board representatives might reasonably need access. There it was again. Access. Not contact. Not observation. Access. And this time she had said it into a microphone. A few heads in the audience turned at that. Somebody behind me shifted in a chair. Howard tried to steer her back toward the prepared language, but the damage was done. Linda lifted her eyes from the packet and asked, very calmly, under what authority any board representative would reasonably need physical access to a locked homeowner entry. Deborah opened her mouth, then hesitated just long enough for the truth to show itself in the gap. Martin stepped in, too polished by half, saying they were speaking generally about compliance responsibilities. Linda asked if compliance responsibilities included testing door handles. That landed like a glass dropped on tile. It was not shouted. It did not need to be. Every sound in the room seemed to shrink around that one question. I felt my folder under my hand, the edge of the top photograph waiting there, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized they were no longer deciding whether I had enough proof. They were deciding how much of it the room was about to see. Howard looked from Linda to Martin, then to Deborah, and I could see the exact moment he understood the meeting was no longer going to stay inside the neat little script printed in front of him. His fingers tightened around his pen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somebody near the back coughed into a paper napkin, and then the room went so quiet I could hear the faint splash of the pool pump outside the clubhouse wall. Martin tried first. Of course he did. He leaned toward his microphone with that same smooth expression he always wore when he wanted confusion to sound like procedure and said the board should avoid speculation until all materials had been reviewed in the proper order. Linda did not even look at him when she answered. She said the proper order would be hearing from the homeowner whose private property had been entered by board representatives. That word entered moved through the room like a draft under a door. Deborah shifted in her chair. I heard the metal legs scrape the floor. Howard cleared his throat and finally looked at me. Mr. Parker, he said, if you have documentation relevant to the circumstances, you may present it now. My pulse had been steady right up until that moment, but standing up in a room full of neighbors makes even good evidence feel heavier. I took the folder from my lap, walked to the front table, and laid the top photograph down in front of Howard first, then Linda, then the rest of the board. No speech yet, just the image. Deborah's hand, fingers spread against the inner porch trim, stained cobalt blue so vividly it almost glowed under the clubhouse lights. Howard leaned forward. Linda picked up her copy immediately. Martin did not touch his for a full 2 seconds. Deborah stared at the tabletop instead, jaw locked tight. I set down the second photograph, the one showing Martin stepping out of the dark SUV at the curb while Deborah stood on my porch. Then the third, the close shot of the blue smear across Deborah's blazer sleeve from wrist to hip. A murmur rose behind me, soft but unmistakable. Howard tapped his pen against the table once and told the room to remain orderly, but his voice had already lost whatever authority it came in with. I explained the timeline plainly. My earlier written complaints, the unanswered emails, the porch camera footage showing repeated visits, the clip of Deborah testing my locked handle after dark, the audio of Martin telling her not to test it again unless they knew I was gone. I did not dramatize any of it because I did not need to. Facts sound louder when they do not have to perform. Martin interrupted as soon as I mentioned the audio. He said that statement had been taken out of context and referred to routine attempts at neighborly contact. Neighborly contact? I almost admired the nerve of it. Linda asked him whether neighborly contact normally involved waiting in a running vehicle while another board member approached a locked front door after dusk. He did not answer directly. Instead, he started talking about escalating tensions, homeowner hostility, and the importance of preserving community standards in difficult interactions. The more he spoke, the more he sounded like a brochure written by somebody trying to hide fingerprints. Deborah finally looked up then, and I realized the blue at her cuff was not the only trace left on her. There was still a faint stain near the cuticle of her right thumb, a tiny crescent she had missed, and once I saw it I could not stop seeing it. She noticed where my eyes went and tucked her hand under the table. Too late. I took out the printed email chain next and placed it beside the photographs. My first complaint about her being on my porch. The follow-up with timestamps. The still image of her near my side glass. No reply. Then the later email from the board about a hazardous condition, sent only after she was caught leaving proof on my doorpost. Linda read through the chain in silence, turned one page, then another, and asked the board secretary whether any formal authorization had ever been issued for physical entry on a homeowner porches. The secretary, a woman named Janet who usually treated meetings like they were church bulletins, looked genuinely rattled. She said no, not to her knowledge. Linda asked whether any policy allowed door handle testing as part of compliance review. Janet said absolutely not. That was when the room changed. It was subtle, but you could feel it. The audience stopped treating this like gossip and started recognizing the shape of a real abuse of authority. Howard rubbed a hand over his mouth and asked Martin directly whether he had been present outside my home on the evening in question. Martin said yes. but only because Deborah had reported a concern. Linda asked what concern had been reported before contact was made. He hesitated. Just enough. Deborah jumped in, too quickly, saying she had reason to believe exterior violations were being concealed. Concealed. Locked doors were now concealment. Privacy was now suspicious. It would have been absurd if it had not been so revealing. I took one final sheet from the folder then, the county property diagram with my lot lines and entry dimensions highlighted in yellow, and slid it across the table. My porch alcove, I said, is private residential space. Not a common area. Not community access. Private. And nobody had permission to be inside it except me and whoever I invite. The word private sat there under those fluorescent lights like a judge had finally entered the room. Deborah swallowed. Martin stopped speaking. And for the first time since this whole thing began, nobody at that table was looking at the blue paint anymore. They were looking at each other. Silence does strange things in a room built for petty rule enforcement. A minute earlier, the clubhouse had felt like every other HOA meeting I had ever sat through. Fluorescent, stale, mildly theatrical. A place where people argued about fence stain and parking angles as if civilization depended on trim color. But now the silence had weight. Howard kept one hand on the county diagram like it might drift away if he let go. Janet was staring at the email chain with both eyebrows lifted, the way people do when they realize the official record is about to become the thing that ruins somebody. Linda set her glasses down carefully on top of the packet in front of her and asked the question nobody there could dodge anymore. Mr. Parker, do you have the actual video available tonight? I told her yes. Martin leaned toward his microphone before Howard could respond and said the board should not review media in an open session without counsel present. Linda turned to him so slowly it almost looked polite. Then perhaps, she said, board members should not conduct themselves in ways that require counsel. A few people in the audience let out short, surprised breaths that would have been laughs anywhere else. Howard asked me to bring my laptop to the front. I did, and when I set it down on the table, the room leaned with me, not physically, but in attention. The clip loaded with that familiar little buffering spin, and for one absurd second I noticed the reflection of the overhead lights on my own screen and thought about how many ordinary evenings had led to this one. Then the porch appeared. Quiet concrete. White trim. Warm porch light. Deborah, stepping into frame with her clipboard tucked under one arm like authority, had accessorized itself. Nobody in the room moved. You could hear the air conditioner kick on. The video showed her looking up and down the street, then sliding into the narrow entry space beside my door. Her hand reached out and flattened on the inner trim exactly where no invited guest would ever need to touch. Then came the blue. Even though everybody had seen the still photographs, motion changed it. In motion, there was no argument left. You could see the instant confusion, the reflexive swipe of her sleeve, the widening stain, the panicked grab at the fabric that only smeared it farther. Somebody in the back muttered, "Oh my God," under their breath. Howard did not tell them to be quiet this time. He was too busy watching the part where Deborah tried my handle after staining herself. The metallic rattle from the speakers sounded even sharper in the room than it had in my kitchen. Deborah made a small sound beside me. Not a word, just the involuntary noise of a person hearing her own choices played back at full volume. Then Martin entered the frame from the curb. He walked up the path with that same controlled pace, looked at the stain, looked at the trim, and the whole audience watched him become part of the scene he had been trying all evening to narrate from outside it. I let the clip continue right up to the audio. Deborah's voice, tight and furious, saying he set me up. Then Martin, clear enough through the porch microphone that no one needed subtitles, saying, "Deborah, I told you not to test the handle again unless we knew he was gone." This time the silence did not last. It cracked. Chairs creaked. Somebody said what? Another person whispered again. Janet covered her mouth with one hand. Howard shut his eyes for a second like he had a headache behind them. Martin tried to speak over the rest of the clip, saying the wording was being misinterpreted, but his voice had lost that smooth boardroom finish. It came out thin, rushed, almost brittle. Linda held up one finger without looking at him, and somehow that tiny gesture stopped him colder than any shout could have. We all listened to the rest. Deborah saying I was supposed to get cited that week. Martin answering, "Not if you keep doing this." When the clip ended, the laptop screen froze on Deborah standing under my porch light with cobalt across her sleeve like a sash she had never wanted to wear. Howard asked for the room to remain orderly, but order had already changed sides. It no longer belonged to the people behind the table. It belonged to the evidence. Deborah finally spoke, and what came out was not apology or even a clean denial. It was anger stripped of strategy. She said homeowners had become impossible, that standards were collapsing, that people lied, hid things, ignored notices, and forced the board to take extra steps. Extra steps. She actually said it. Linda asked her to define extra steps. Deborah looked around the room as if searching for the version of reality that had supported her until 5 minutes ago and could not find it. Martin tried again to intervene, but Howard raised his hand and told him to stop speaking. That was the first direct command anyone at that table had given him all night. Then Howard looked at Janet and asked her to pull the board bylaws and conduct policy from the meeting binder. Janet's fingers shook a little as she flipped pages. Linda asked that the footage, the stills, and the email chain be entered into the record. Howard agreed. Entered into the record. There it was. The moment private trespass became official history. Deborah stared at the frozen image on my screen, and I could see the first true realization settling into her face. The stain was never the problem. The record was. Because paint can be scrubbed. Fabric can be replaced. But once a room full of witnesses hears you call a locked front door an obstacle to access, there is no detergent in the world strong enough to wash that sentence clean. What happened next did not feel dramatic at first. It felt procedural, which was somehow even more satisfying. Howard asked Janet to read the conduct policy aloud, and her voice shook only on the first line before settling into that dry administrative rhythm people use when the words suddenly matter much more than they expected. Board representatives were prohibited from entering private property without express permission except in narrowly defined emergencies. Routine compliance review was limited to visual observation from lawful common areas. Any board action exposing the association to liability required immediate disclosure and temporary recusal of involved parties pending review. The room heard every syllable. No one had to translate it. Deborah sat very still with both hands below the table now, but the damage had already climbed out into the light. Martin tried one last time to put structure around the collapse, saying the board should move into executive session and consult counsel before taking any action. Linda asked whether counsel would somehow change the fact that the footage showed unauthorized entry, attempted door handle testing, and prior knowledge of repeated attempts. Howard did not answer her directly. He did something better. He asked Deborah whether she disputed that she had physically entered my private porch alcove and made contact with the inner trim near my front door. Deborah looked at him as if the question itself were a betrayal. Then she said she had only stepped in as far as necessary. Necessary. That word landed just as badly as access had landed earlier. Howard asked necessary for what? Deborah opened her mouth, and for a second I thought she might finally say the quiet part in full, that she believed my house existed under her personal jurisdiction, that my locked door offended her more than any violation ever could. Instead, she said for inspection. Linda leaned forward and asked what visible condition required contact with a locked entry surface after dusk. Deborah had no answer for that one. Not a real one. Martin stepped in again, but this time Howard cut him off before he got 5 words out. Then Howard looked down at the bylaws, looked back at the frozen image on my laptop, and said the board would take immediate interim action. You could feel the room straighten. He moved that Deborah Whitmore and Martin Keeler be suspended from board activity, pending formal review of conduct, access practices, and prior homeowner complaints. Linda seconded it before he had fully finished speaking. Janet called the vote with a pen in her hand and a colorless expression on her face, and one by one the remaining board members answered yes. Even the ones who had spent months nodding along with Deborah's little kingdom of standards could read a wall when the evidence was projected on it in cobalt and audio. The motion passed. Deborah made a small disbelieving sound, somewhere between outrage and panic, and stood up so fast her chair tipped back and clattered onto the floor. Nobody rushed to help her. That might have been the loudest part of the whole night, not the chair, but the lack of movement after it. She looked around the room as if she expected somebody to rescue the old version of events for her, the one where she was the enforcer and I was the difficult homeowner hiding behind excuses. But all she found were neighbors who had just watched her call a locked front door an inconvenience. Martin stayed seated a moment longer, staring at the tabletop with his jaw set so hard I could see the muscles moving near his ear. When he finally stood, he adjusted the cuff of his quarter zip out of pure habit, the way men do when they are trying to recover dignity through fabric. It did not work. Howard informed them both that they were to leave the meeting room and provide any further statements through the board's review process. Deborah looked at me then, finally, really looked at me for the first time all evening, and there was no superiority left in her face. There was anger, yes, and humiliation, and that strange hollow disbelief people get when consequences arrive in a form they once reserved for other people. But there was no authority. The blue had taken that from her before the meeting even started. As they walked past the front row of chairs, I caught a faint glimmer at the edge of Deborah's cuff under the fluorescent light. She had changed jackets, scrubbed her skin, altered the story, and the stain had still followed her into the room. That felt important. Outside the clubhouse windows, the pool lights rippled across the dark water in pale broken lines, and inside, neighbors began whispering again, only. Now the whispers had direction, not gossip, memory. Howard asked if I wished to submit anything further for the record. I told him only that I wanted written confirmation that no board member would enter my property again without my permission, and that all prior complaints I had submitted would be preserved with the footage. He nodded and said they would be. Linda added that the board should notify the association membership that compliance observation did not authorize physical access to homeowner entries. That got another yes vote, fast, clean, public. By the time I packed my folder and closed my laptop, the room no longer felt like a place built to control homeowners. It felt like a place where two people had finally run out of polished language. I walked out into the warm night air with the smell of chlorine and fresh-cut grass hanging over the parking lot, and halfway to my truck, I realized something I had not felt in months. My house was going to be mine again. The official email came 2 days later at 8:12 in the morning, and I remember the exact time because I was standing at my kitchen counter pouring coffee when my phone lit up and Martin Keeler's name was gone from the board signature line. So was Deborah Whitmore's. The message was brief, colder than apology, and more useful because of it. The board confirmed that no representative of the association was authorized to enter private residential entry spaces without express homeowner permission, that all compliance observations were restricted to lawful common area sightlines, and that any prior practices inconsistent with that policy were suspended pending review. Suspended pending review was neighborhood language for we know what happened, and we know other people know it too. By noon the rumor had hardened into fact. Deborah had stepped down before the formal review could finish, which did not surprise me at all. People like her never leave because they understand the line they crossed. They leave because the room stopped confusing confidence for legitimacy. Martin lasted 4 more days. Then his resignation went out in the same clipped format, with the same sterile board font, as if a man could disappear behind 12-point Arial and a polite thank you for his service. The neighborhood changed after that, not all at once, not with speeches or dramatic reckoning, but in the quiet ways communities always do when power shifts and everyone pretends they saw it coming. Neighbors who had barely nodded to me for months started stopping at the mailbox to ask how I was doing. Melissa brought over banana bread on a paper plate and said she had always thought Deborah was too comfortable near other people's homes. Grant, walking his dog, admitted Martin had once tried to tell him his garage interior needed to look more presentable when the door was open. Linda Carver became the accidental folk hero of the subdivision, though I suspect she hated that. She sent one final board-wide notice clarifying homeowner privacy boundaries, complaint procedures, and camera rights, and reading that email felt like watching a lock click into place from 50 yards away. The best part was not their embarrassment. It was the silence that returned to my house afterward. Real silence. Honest silence. No heels on the porch after dusk. No motion alerts that made my stomach tighten. No shifted doormat. No unlatched gate. No strange little clues arranged like someone else had been testing the seams of my life while I was gone. One Saturday morning about a week later, I pulled the leftover cobalt paint back down from the garage shelf and carried it out to the porch. The air smelled like cut grass and warm concrete, and the maple tree out front was beginning to throw broader summer shade across the yard. I taped the edge of the column carefully and stirred the paint until it turned rich and glossy again. Then I repainted the whole inner side of that post, not because it needed hiding, but because I wanted it clean and intentional. No smear, no half mark, just one solid band of deep blue exactly where the boundary stood. As the brush moved up and down, the bristles made that soft, scratchy sound fresh paint always makes against wood, and for the first time since this whole thing started, the color belonged entirely to me again. It was not a trick anymore. It was not evidence. It was a choice, a reminder, a line rendered visible. A couple walking by on the sidewalk slowed just enough to glance over, and I remember one of them saying, "That is a bold color." I smiled and said it holds up well, which was true in more ways than they knew. Later that evening I sat in my living room with the blinds open, the lamp on low, and watched the porch light catch that blue edge through the side glass. It looked almost black until the light hit it right, and then it came alive. Funny thing about proof. Once it does its job, it leaves behind something quieter than revenge and stronger than anger. It leaves order. It leaves memory. It leaves a place feeling like itself again. I never heard from Deborah directly after the meeting. No apology. No note. No final performance in the driveway. But about 3 weeks later, I saw her once at the grocery store across town. She was in line near the floral section, wearing a pale cardigan and holding a carton of eggs. And when our eyes met, she looked away first. That was all. No scene. No words. Just the smallest turn of a head from a woman who had spent months acting like my front door was an inconvenience to her authority. And I will tell you the truth. That tiny moment felt cleaner than any argument ever could. Because justice is not always a slammed gavel, or a public confession, or some perfect speech that leaves everybody clapping and folding chairs. Sometimes it is much quieter than that. Sometimes it is a locked door that stays respected. A board table with 2 empty seats. A policy rewritten because your evidence gave language no place left to hide. Sometimes it is a porch column drying in the evening air, cobalt blue and unmistakable, while the house behind it finally, completely, belongs to you again.